Alright guys, welcome to the beautiful Central Pacific of the Mariana Islands for our basic straight-in VFR landing tutorial in the A-18C Hornet. Now this tutorial is going to go over the very basics of a nice straight-in landing with a 3-degree glide path. This is going to be the very basic building blocks for all of the fancier, more intricate kinds of landings you'll make in the future, such as overheads to airfields, as well as case 1, 2s, and 3s to an aircraft carrier. So to start off here, let's go ahead and start slowing our aircraft down to about 350 knots of indicated airspeed, which is going to be the pattern airspeed you're going to be using for almost every type of landing in the FA-18, so it's good to have that muscle memory going early. So that's looking good, about 350 knots. Let's turn our auto throttle back on, and then we'll run a fence check, so that way we can get our jet safed up and our cockpit set up for our landing today. We'll make sure that master arm is set to safe, that we've got plenty of fuel for our pattern and landing, and we don't need to hit a tanker first. Now let's reset our bingo to about 3,000 pounds as a nice reminder in case we get a little bit low. Next, we'll make sure that we have our external lights turned on. For our emitters today, I'm going to leave our radar in the operate position and have the radar up on my right DDI to monitor any conflicting traffic that might also be going into Andersen Air Force Base. For my FLIR switch, I'm going to bring it to the off or standby position, so that way in case we have a bit of a harder landing, we won't be damaging our lightning pod. Next, we'll go ahead and make sure that we have our dispensers set to safe, and our ECM switch in either the standby or the off position. And if you're getting distracted by all the beeps and bonks of your RWR as you're trying to make your landing, go ahead and turn your RWR off if you're in safe and permissive airspace. But if you think there might be some roving MiGs around, I recommend keeping that guy on as a nice little warning. Finally, we'll also need to make sure that we have our local altimeter setting for our landing at our airfield. You can see this in DCS by hitting the left Alt and B key on your keyboard and bringing up the briefing page by default in DCS. We can see under QNH 2985 inches of mercury. That's what we want for our Western type aircraft such as the FA-18C here. So we'll go ahead and make sure that is set in the standby altimeter. 2985 is set, and we're good to go there. For navigation, we have two options for navigating and getting the geometry right for our landing here at Andersen Air Force Base. We can either use our INS waypoints that we've set in the mission editor as a bit of an RNAV visual approach, or we can use a TACAN radial and set a course line to fly that radial on into the runway. For the sake of simplicity today, we'll just use our INS waypoints that we set in the mission editor. One for a runway lineup point, and two for our actual runway we're going to be landing on today. So to kind of show that a little bit graphically on our HSI here, we'll hit sequence 1, and that'll give us a nice dashed line for us to follow right on into the runway. I usually like to have my HSI up on my left DDI so that way I can see a little bit better without having to look down into the cockpit, and I'll bring my checklist page up on my MPCD. For landing, of course, we need to make sure our wheels are down, flaps to full, hook is down for a carrier landing, or set hook bypass to field for a field landing, anti-skid on for an airfield landing, off for a carrier landing, harness, locked, and dispensers are set to safe. It's also important to note your aircraft weight. The max landing weight in the FA-18C is going to be 34,000 pounds. And based off of our current fuel consumption, I think we'll make that no problem by the time we land. So we're about 33 nautical miles from waypoint 1, which is our runway lineup point. So we'll go ahead and kick the autopilot off, and we'll just start a nice gentle descent on down to about 5,000 feet by the time we hit waypoint 1, so that way we can get set up for our nice 3-degree glide path down to the runway. Now, let's go ahead and jump over to our handy Photoshop document and talk about how we can calculate a 3-degree glide slope to give you guys some hard numbers and some gates you can fly through to get yourself into a good position for your landing. So here on our little diagram, let's draw out a runway that's going to represent our Anderson Air Force Base for today. And we've got ourselves a nice little control tower with a little radar on top. And we've got our jet setting up for a landing out here with our little tail and our wings. So for a normal 3-degree glide slope, we're going to want to calculate this using a 3-to-1 descent ratio. So let's write that out here. So 3-to-1 descent ratio. This means that for every 3 nautical miles we travel across the ground, we need to be descending 1,000 feet in order to reach a 3-degree glide slope. Now, some of you guys in the comments out there might be saying, well, Spud is not actually 3-to-1, but it's close enough for a VFR approach in our FA-18 that it's a really, really good rule of thumb to use. So the way we'd calculate this out to give us 2 really nice gates to kind of fly through on our way down to the runway is if we draw a line that's supposed to represent about 3 nautical miles from the end of our runway. So we'll put a little 3 here, nautical miles, and then we'll draw another gate that's going to be about 6 nautical miles from the runway. Here, 6 nautical miles. Then, as to draw out our descent here, at 3 nautical miles, we need to be at 1,000 feet above the runway touchdown height. Then at 6 nautical miles, we need to be at 2,000 feet above the runway touchdown height. And this is going to give us 2 really awesome gates that we can fly through on the way down to the runway to get that beautiful 3-degree glide slope. However, there's one more thing that we need to do with this calculation to kind of make it match up more with what we actually have here at Anderson Air Force Base. So if we go back to DCS and we open up the F10 map, and we scroll into Anderson Air Force Base here, and we place our mouse over the touchdown zone of the runway we're slated to land on, we can see up in the top left there that it's at 597 feet. So for the sake of making this easier, why don't we just round that up to 600 feet for our touchdown zone elevation, which is totally adequate for a nice VFR approach like we're doing today. So on our calculation here, we're just going to add 600 to these values. So let's go ahead and put 1,600 feet for our second gate. And for our first gate we're going to fly through, that's going to be 2,600 feet MSL. Please keep in mind, guys, that MSL is above mean sea level. So that's from sea level. And AGL is above ground level. The first values we calculated would be AGL. These values, with the runway touchdown zone height added, are going to be MSL. It's much, much easier to calculate off of MSL and just fly MSL values for a nice straight-in or even an overhead pattern, as opposed to trying to use AGL values with your radar altimeter, because as we can see here on the map in DCS, Anderson Air Force Base is on the top of some cliffs 600 feet above the water level itself. So just trying to give you guys the easiest path forward. So we'll go ahead and continue our descent on down. We can see here that our indicated airspeed is climbing rather rapidly, even though we have our auto throttle turned on. The reason for this is your auto throttle in the F-18 actually holds your current Mach number, not your current indicated airspeed. And your airspeed is going to increase at a rate of 2% for every 1,000 feet of altitude you descend. So just keep that in mind, so that way you don't get yourself too fast, too close into the airfield, and you won't have time to correct for it. So go ahead and pull the throttle back, kicking off the auto throttle once again.
Altitude.
And we're going to start slowing our aircraft down even more. Oh, it looks like we descended below about 5,000 a little bit. Not too worried about it. And we'll hold about 330 knots of indicated airspeed for now. Now, the absolute key for landing the Hornet and really any other jet in DCS is with jets, you need to be as slow, precise, and methodical on the controls as possible. Your F-18 is really not going to like it if you're fighting the jet on the controls using very jerky throttle and stick inputs, and even rudder inputs as well. So just remember, and always keep the mantra, slow, smooth, and steady on the controls with your Hornet. So we can start to get a little bit of a glimpse of Guam out there in the distance, so that's perfect. And as we get closer to waypoint 1 here, I'm going to start slowing the jet down to about 300 knots indicated, so that way we can just keep the jet coming on down, nice and slowly to our VFE and VG in the F-18, which is going to be 250 knots of indicated airspeed. Alright, for the rest of the tutorial here, I'm going to open up the controls indicator, and I'll have it blown up bigger in the top left of the screen here, so you guys can see exactly what I'm doing with my throttle, my stick, and my rudders. Alright, coming to about 10 nautical miles from our runway lineup point. At this point, I'm going to start descending down to about 3,000 feet MSL, so that way we can get ready to hit our first gate at 2,600 feet, 6 nautical miles from the runway. You can see here as I'm flying the jet, even just on my approach here, everything is nice and smooth and gentle on my stick and on my throttles. There's no reason to fight the jet, just let the jet fly itself. That's why it's a fly-by-wire jet, to make everything as easy on you as possible as the pilot. And we'll start slowing to an airspeed of about 300 indicated. Just working our way down towards that first gate at 6 nautical miles from the runway. As you get better and better with your landings in the Hornet, you can of course start to push the field a little bit more, which means staying faster and clean longer and longer and longer until you get closer and closer to the airfield. And of course, an overhead pattern is the ultimate version of pushing the field. Alright, so close enough to about 300 knots of indicated airspeed. We can see Anderson Air Force Base out there, and we can start to see our runway, so that is perfect. We'll start making a turn towards the runway. And we just want to fly right on this nice dash sequence line in our HSI for our little pseudo RNAV visual approach. And we can see we're about 11 nautical miles from the runway. And just in the spirit of what we talked about of getting set up nice and early, let's start to pull the throttle back. We'll try to meet 250 knots of indicated airspeed, so that way we can drop our gear and our flaps by the time we get to about 6 nautical miles from the runway. And then a cool little tip in the F-18 is if you're having a hard time seeing your runway or airfield, you can always designate your waypoint on top of the runway as a target, and you'll get a nice little diamond there for you. Okay guys, let's go ahead and explore what on-speed AOA actually means and what the region of reverse command is, so that way we can make landing the Hornet as easy as possible for you guys, regardless of whether it's an airfield or an aircraft carrier. So let's pop our speed brake out here so that way we can get under 250 knots and dirty up the aircraft. And we're not even going to be worrying about the airfield for this demonstration. This is purely a demonstration of what on-speed AOA actually is. So the term on-speed AOA can be a little bit confusing. Let's go ahead and bring the flaps down, and we'll bring the gear down as well. On-speed AOA is really just the angle of attack at a low airspeed with your aircraft dirty up that is specified by the aircraft designers for the perfect angle of attack for landing. We need to be at on-speed AOA so that way we can be nice and slow for our landing, but also so that way if we're landing on an aircraft carrier, our hook is going to be positioned right to snag a wire on the aircraft carrier. Now, of course, to get to on-speed AOA, all we need to do is get nice and slow, get the gear and the flaps down, and then trim the velocity vector up into the E bracket. You have two ways of knowing you're at on-speed AOA. Your velocity vector in the middle of the E bracket, or a nice orange donut on the AOA indexer. If you're trimmed nose down too much, you're going to get a red chevron. If you're trimmed nose up too much, you're going to get a green chevron. But if you're perfect right in the middle, you're going to be right in the middle of that E bracket, and you're also going to have that nice amber donut. So being on speed AOA is a state of your aircraft that can be achieved with any aircraft. It's in fact what you need to land any aircraft, whether that's a Cessna 172, a Boeing 747, or our F-A-18 today. And all aircraft exhibit a behavior called the region of reverse command. And that's where your controls actually reverse. In normal forward flight, to climb, we pull back on the stick. To descend, we push forward on the stick. In the region of reverse command, we do the opposite. To speed up, we push forward on the stick and decrease our pitch. To slow down, we pull back on the stick and increase our pitch. And to climb, we increase our thrust. And to descend, we decrease our thrust. To show that in motion here, to show a climb, we increase our thrust, and the jet climbs. To descend, we decrease our thrust, and the jet descends. Now this is where a lot of new DCS World pilots get themselves into trouble, because even though I just said that you increase airspeed by pushing forward on the stick and decrease airspeed by pulling back on the stick, the FA-18 is a fly-by-wire aircraft, and it's always looking to try and compensate for those pitch changes. So all you gotta do is trim the jet to bring the velocity vector right to the middle of the E bracket and have that nice amber donut, and you really don't need to push forward or back on the stick at all. Just make small changes using your trim hat. If you need to turn, such as turning from the base leg to final, simply just roll the aircraft and adjust your thrust to maintain your altitude. Same thing for rolling out, and same thing for rolling the other direction. Because in the FA-18, our GE F404 engines have a pretty long spool-up time for a fighter jet engine, it's important to always stay ahead of the aircraft. You always want to be making throttle changes. If your throttle is stationary, you're going to have a problem, and you're probably going to get behind the power curve. So just keep that in mind, and it will always help you out. Another thing to keep in mind here is if you're at on-speed AOA and you have an amber donut, you don't need to memorize an airspeed for landing. Airspeed will automatically be set for on-speed AOA depending on aircraft weight, environmental conditions, things of that nature. So as long as you've got the velocity vector in the middle of the E bracket and a nice amber donut, that means you're at the correct airspeed for landing. Whether that is at the perfect weight to land on an aircraft carrier, or if you're making an emergency landing with an overweight aircraft, it doesn't matter. As long as you got that amber donut and you're in the middle of the E-bracket, your airspeed doesn't matter, so ignore your airspeed. Alrighty guys, now that we've explored what the region of reverse command and what on-speed AOA actually is, let's continue on with our approach. So we've met the gates that we set out in our little diagram, and we're now on more or less a perfect 3-degree glide slope. And you guys can see just how gentle and easy I'm being on the controls. I'm making teeny tiny corrections and teeny tiny adjustments. And we can see, based off of the HUD and our pitch ladder, we are right at about a 3 to 4 degree glide slope, which is perfect. Always keep in mind, guys, that we don't want to flare in the Hornet, we want to fly it right down to the runway. And if we realize that our descent rate is a bit excessive, we can always cushion the landing with more thrust as opposed to pulling back on the stick. Probably will notice here on the controls indicator that I'm not pulling back on the stick whatsoever. I'm only using the throttle to adjust my glide slope and thus my descent rate. No pitch movements on the stick whatsoever. And that's exactly what we want to see. Looks like my descent rate's a little bit high, so we're going to cushion it with a bit of thrust at the end here. There we go. We'll bring a little bit of thrust in. You can see the throttle is always moving. The throttle never stops moving. And once we're on the runway, throttle to idle, speed brake coming out. And then we'll start to bring the stick all the way back to our laps to deflect our big old horizontal stabilizers to add even more drag to the jet. Then once we're under about 100 knots of indicated airspeed, we can start to gently get on the wheel brakes, making sure that we use those wheel brakes to keep the nose pointed right down the runway. As we start getting to taxi speed, we want to move off to the right-hand side of the runway until we reach an exit taxiway, so that way, if we have a wingman landing in close succession behind us, and he lands a little bit long or a little bit fast, he can move off to the left side of the runway if he needs to actually pass us while rolling on down. Alright, so looks like our exit taxiway up here is going to be to the left, so we'll just make sure that we look off to the left-hand side before we actually cross the runway. Alright, so we're going to be exiting Foxtrot here. Look over our shoulder, make sure we don't have a wingman that's going to come barreling down our left-hand side. Alright guys, that concludes our VFR straight-in landing tutorial for the DCS F A-18. And like I said at the beginning of this video, this really is the building blocks for all of the more fancy types of landings that are usually more fun to make here in DCS, such as overheads to airfields, and of course those different carrier recovery procedures, case 1s, 2s, and 3s. So if you liked the video and it did help you out, please give it a like and a subscribe, and we'll see you in the next one. Fly safe out there, guys, and enjoy this beautiful game.